As you probably know, we've been commemorating the 400th anniversary of the landing of Africans in British North America for almost 2 years now. This is the end of our second year. I'm glad you're here. Thank you for coming. We know you didn't have to be. I'm guessing that you've been participating in this in the past and you just knew it was too good. It's going to be too good to miss. So thank you for showing up. Once again, I want to just take a minute to thank the people in the offices who've helped to make this possible. Thank you to our department chair, Scott Levi, who initiated this series. The committee that worked very hard from the start to come up with a fantastic list of scholars from which we selected our speakers. Thanks to all the speakers themselves, whose work has educated us, and today we'll do the same. They've not just educated us, but entertained us and helped us to think harder, on top of that. They've done a lot for us. Thanks also to all the staff persons in the history department who have arranged in the past, who've arranged lodging and travel when people were able to do that. They've made posters and paid bills, and they did and they still do a lot of work to help make this series possible. So thanks to Laura Seeger, Steve McCann, Chris Adams, and Rhonda Maynard. Thank you to the Department of African and African American Studies and the Center for Historical Studies, especially John Brooke, who's with us. And thank you to Dr. James Moore, Director of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, and the Ohio State Energy Partners for their generous and critical financial support. It's been very important to this whole process, and especially this year when we had lost funding because of the COVID crisis. And finally, thank you to the audience again for showing up here. Your participation has always been welcome. It has been critical to our success, and I don't imagine that it'll be any different today. We know that even with the constraints that COVID has put on all our movements, you still could have chosen to be someplace else today, Friday afternoon. So thank you for choosing to be here. I'll turn this over to my colleague, Professor Jeffries, who's going to introduce our distinguished guest today and also the program. Thank you all for coming.
Well, thank you very much, Stephanie, Dr. Shaw, not only for the introduction, but also for your leadership and planning with the 60 Legacies of 1619 series, both last year and this year, as well as a thank you to our colleague, John Brooke, who is managing things with others behind the curtain. So thank you very much. I'm on backup camera right now. My computer froze up right before we were about to launch, and so I'm getting that up and going right now. But we got the cell phone going, but that's all right. We're gonna make it happen because that's just what we do in the African diaspora. We just make stuff happen. So I want to introduce, and I was trying to pull up their official bios, and maybe I can get them up in time. Our guest panelists for today's program. I'm really excited about this program. It was something that we have been thinking about as we were doing the planning for this lecture series and for this year and looking at legacies, this question of policing Black America. Of course, we are all familiar and all are well aware of the tragic incidences. Uh-oh, we've lost your volume. Can you hear me? Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah, now, yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Okay. Well, if you can't, I know Stephanie may have lost the volume, but we'll see. All right. Well, here, this is what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna stop talking real quick. I'm gonna get into our guests, right? Carl Sutler is assistant professor of history at Emory University, the author most recently of Presumed Criminal. Shannon King, Dr. Shannon King, who used to be with us here in Ohio, right up the road at Worcester, is now in Connecticut at Fairfield. There's some wonderful, both of these gentlemen are doing wonderful work on policing in America and understanding and writing in researching on sort of the history of policing in America. What has it been? What are its roots? How has it evolved? What problems does it create for Black folk in America? And so what we're going to do today, this evening, is we're going to have a conversation and dialogue between the three of us. We have the Q&A. The chat is open. The Q&A is open. If you have questions as we work through the conversation, please put those in there. We'll be monitoring those. We can work them into the conversation. We'll go to about 5:30 or so, about an hour, so we can really get a good sense of what our guests, their thoughts and opinions. And then we will open it up a little bit more to the full discussion to get the thoughts and ideas of the guests, those who are watching, involved. So let me begin, Carl. I want to begin with you, Dr. Sutler. And your work, just like Shannon's work, really looks at this tension between crime and policing. But I want to begin a little bit, perhaps not so much on the academic side, but a little bit of both the academic and the personal. As a scholar, as a researcher, engaging this material, what is it that got you started in this work, looking at this particular aspect of the Black experience and the American experience?
Yeah, no, so, first off, again, I want to echo much of the thanks. I understand what it's like to put on these lecture series in COVID world. And so the technical difficulties and the work that goes into it, I appreciate everybody, that helped us get here to this point today on this Friday. What got me into it was, it's actually going to sound funny, because much of what I wrote in the book was sparked by an interest that I took into graduate school, right? That led to the dissertation project. However, I have been interested in these conversations around criminality and criminalization, just didn't have the language for it since really I was like a freshman in high school. And I actually shared this kind of anecdote in the acknowledgement section of the book, because I do think it's important to understand kind of that origin story. And I tell people, somewhat jokingly, that what really got me into these conversations around criminalization was actually the Denzel Washington movie, The Hurricane, right? Which is about the, Reuben Hurricane Carter, boxer who spends, a bulk of the prime of his career incarcerated. And what blew my mind about the film, and again, I was a freshman in high school, right? So this is 14-year-old freshman thinking, was that everybody around the case knew, or at least the way the movie portrayed it, knew that he was innocent, right? And so freshman in high school, Carl was like, this is based on a real book. So I go to the library, I get the book, I read the book, and I am floored. And I remember my high school history teacher asking me the question, or, he asked me like what I did this weekend. I told him what I was doing, and I read this book. And for him, he was just like, he asked me a question. He was like, well, Carl, do you think Reuben Hurricane Carter would write a book from his prison cell admitting his guilt, or would he write a book from his prison cell in which he wanted people to believe him to be innocent, right? And in that moment, whether he realized it or not, he really sparked what became an intellectual journey around narratives of innocence and guilt, right? About like, he who holds the pen, holds the power, right? In the sense of like how much, goes into who is considered guilty and who is not. And, who is committing crimes, what the punishment on the other side looks like. And so really that sparked what became a very long journey into kind of, what then I was able to develop language around, which becomes the book, around, particular conversations around Black youth and criminality in New York City from the 1930s to the 1960s. And, much of what I was even finding in this moment was that there were a lot of actors, right, that went into this, that it wasn't just the legal system, but, it was a range of societal forces about who was controlling narratives around criminality, be it politicians, the media, social scientists, celebrities, athletes, like they all had a little say. And so, that's anecdote, right? But much of what influenced kind of my thinking around these broader questions and constructions of criminality that were tied to so many public policies since post-war period forward. You're muted, Hasan.
I got you. One day I'm going to get this thing figured out. So Shannon, I want to ask you the same thing, sort of your origin story as sort of an academic and the intersection of the personal and the professional with those New York roots.
Well, you know, I would have to say the same thing. You're also a New Yorker and you're familiar with, you know, New York City during the 1980s, right? And so we're both around the same age, you know, and so in terms of coming of age in New York City, you don't really have the language for it, as Carl said, but you do witness that the police are everywhere, right? So just in terms of the police presence, they seemed everywhere and they were involved in everything, right? Whether it was actually attempting to stop crime or just harassing passersby, right? They were everywhere. But for me, you know, I witnessed a lot of these things, whether it was in the train station, whether it was in the streets. And so one particular case that we, as Americans know as the Central Park Five, you know, one of my classmates, Yusuf Salam, who I went to middle school and high school with, was one of those individuals who eventually were exonerated. And so, you know, I could talk about not only watching it on the news and this idea of, you know, looking at this kid who I knew personally, who, you know, we were both art majors, who all of a sudden was missing from school, right? And, you know, it switched from this young man who was brilliant and who is still brilliant, who's a doctor now, right? To this person who was criminalized and was a criminal. And so there was a clear juxtaposition between the individual that I knew and the person that was being posted on newspapers, television, and the like. It was also related to the fact that I'm also from Harlem, right? And so I had actually, you know, I wasn't there that night in Central Park, but I had been to Central Park as a young kid, and I had been around, you know, as a latch, as they used to call us latchkey kids, as a kid who, you know, wasn't necessarily, didn't have all the accommodations of like the community center and all those things. So, you know, you're out and about, running around, you know, playing, and I had no idea that these small things could be blown up in such a way that they would become actual political issues, and blown up in such a way that they would actually shape, you know, local politics, municipal politics, and national politics, right? And so for me, you know, in terms of my first book, Whose Harlem Is This Anyway, you know, in one of my chapters on police brutality, a lot of what I focused on was how policing was very much connected to class issues, that working class poor people were policed in a particular way as opposed to middle class or white folks, right? And then in my newer project, Policing the Crisis, you know, I engage these issues much more broadly and connect how questions around housing and jobs are also connected to these questions around policing in many ways that we tend to more recently talk about defunding. You know, in the 1930s, they didn't have that language, but they certainly were clear that there was a relationship between these economic and political issues and the questions of policing. So that's sort of how my personal, interpersonal, but also sort of local experiences shape my scholarship.
Shannon, both you and Carl talked about sort of those personal experiences and the ways in which you, your life experiences informed your interest in this topic of policing. But in your work, both in Presumed Criminal and in Whose Harlem Is This Anyway, you both don't start in the contemporary period. You take a long view look at this, looking at roots and origins. Shannon, you're looking at the 20s. Carl, you start sort of the 30s, 40s, and moving into sort of mid-century period. So Shannon, I want to begin with you a little bit. Could you share some of your thoughts on sort of the roots of policing, sort of its origins, its purpose as it relates to African Americans?
Sure. So I think it's important to understand policing broadly, right? And so an important way to think about the origins of policing is thinking about the ways in which policing and police have been used, right, to weaken or disempower the weak and to empower the powerful. And so what that might mean is that might mean industrialists will use the police to beat down a strike. Or in the case of African-American history, that might mean slave patrols are seeking their property, right? Which could be runaway slaves, for example, when we think about the Fugitive Act. Or in the case of New York City in 1863 in the draft riots, we see the police, we see the Irish, and we see how the Irish and the police, many of the police officers are actually Irish, attacked African-Americans. And so in many ways, one might argue that these are questions of crime, but actually these are ways to reinforce white supremacy, reinforce segregation, or reinforce class issues, right? And so I think that's an important way to think about the bigger picture that helps us sort of interrogate the notion that policing is really about or always about fighting crime, right? Right? So it becomes important to think about the big picture rather than the ways in which policing is often used as a way to argue that sort of to think about Carl's important work. Well, they're criminals, which is a certain kind of presumption that's reproduced and recreated in a particular way. And so that allows them to legitimize their actions if we're presumed criminal, right? Where in reality, they're really reinforcing labor, class, racial, gender, and sexuality relations, right? And so that's an important way to think about it. And in Whose Harlem Is This Anyway, all of that is laid out, and as you said, in my case, in the 1920s.
Carl, before we even get to that sort of mid-century moment in New York City and dealing with policing, the idea, and here I'm thinking about our mutual friend and colleague Khalil Muhammad's work, this idea of the formation of the association in the minds of white Americans of criminalization or criminality in African Americans. I mean, you titled your first book, Presumed Criminal. Clearly, this isn't something that just emerged mid-century. So you too were seeing sort of the roots of this early on. So whereas Shannon was talking about sort of that origin of policing, could you say a little bit about sort of the origins of this idea of the presumption of criminality among African Americans?
Yeah. And I mean, always I am indebted to the work that Khalil Muhammad does in condemnation of Blackness, right? Because it really does shape so much thinking around how we get to this point, right? That I actually like pick up in, right? I mean, Khalil's book is late 19th century into the 20th century. And I pick up, at the 30s, really kind of along, a similar kind of trajectory about like, the people who are shaping these narratives are influential in the sense that they are seen as legit, right? Like we're talking about scientists, right? We're talking about social scientists. We're talking about, the establishment of crime statistics, right? And what that actually means and how these things are going to be read, right? These are legit institutions, be it the local police or, the FBI, and how they're going to document these, the behaviors, right, that are being done, or that are moving around, how the police are kind of moving property, right, to Shannon's point, and moving people around literally. And so, much of what Khalil does in that work really influenced my thinking about presumptions of criminality and how and who, right, was kind of the driver. And when I say that, I'm not just thinking about, because again, a lot of what Khalil does, takes us to social scientists, takes us to the stats, right? And I just remember, like, if in fact I can't rely on crime statistics to even help me as a historian, right? If in fact these actual crime statistics as a primary document are problematic, how then do I get into a narrative around who was committing crimes in these spaces, right? Because we've relied on those as documents for so long, right? And so this becomes somewhat of a paradigm shift, even as scholars, as historians looking back to the past, right? If in fact we can't trust crime data, then where do we go to read crime? How then do we make sense of it? Do we go to the newspapers, right? But then you realize that even the newspapers are kind of falling for the okie doke time and time again, right? And so we have to read Black newspapers different than we're reading mainstream newspapers. Much of what led me to study this in youth in particular was that age became kind of a marker of how we then were going to understand it, especially amongst Black communities. That is, young people, like, people are like, oh, you're writing about this day in which juvenile delinquency is a popular kind of trend, right? This is the height of, in mid 20th century, we're talking, Rebel Without a Cause, we're talking West Side Story, right? We're talking about white delinquents in general. And, in terms of popular culture, there's much around the narrative around white delinquents. But if you look at who was, actually going to prison or who was being separated for their families and institutionalized, it actually wasn't white kids in the way that popular culture might lead you to believe. And so this is sort of like, so then you do a newspaper search and you're just like, youth crime, 1950s, give me everything, right? And you do return a solid number of white juvenile delinquent acts, right? But what you realize is that they weren't categorizing Black youths in the same way, right? They were calling Black kids young man, right? They weren't affording them teenage kind of labels, right? In the same way that white kids were. And so you realize that even the media becomes a culprit in this narrative around kind of adultifying, right, for lack of a better word, Black kids, but also just not allowing them the privilege of being young, right? So not only was this criminalization process one that was racist, right, in the sense of how it was categorizing Black people, but it was also racist in how it was categorizing age, right? And so age becomes sort of like my interlocutor because the juvenile justice system was designed to buffer young people away from the stigma of adult criminality. And that was just not a privilege that was ever afforded to Black youth.
Brother Shannon, I saw you with the church head nod as Carl was saying. Your thoughts to what Dr. Sutler was just saying.
So yeah, so part of what I do in the next book, which covers the 30s and 40s, is precisely what Carl is talking about. And so the dynamic becomes, if we think about the bigger picture, we have to talk about mobs, and there's all kinds of movies about it, and it's fetishized and it's romanticized, right? On the one hand. On the other hand, we can also talk about youth crime. And as Carl laid out, there's the presumption that, folks were really targeting all youth regardless of race. But when you actually read the source material, not only are Black youth targeted, but they're using particular language to describe them, right? So again, not only are Black youth targeted, but they're marking them in a particular way. So it becomes hoodlum, thug, etc., gangs, right? It's like, going back to New York City and thinking about the 80s and the Central Park Five and the whole Wilding craze, right? It's that same language which completely erases their youth. People begin to sort of criminalize Black groups. I played basketball, so I was always with a bunch of tall brothers, and we had a white brother on the team as well. But we're going through the train station, and the police are stopping us, and we're just taking a train to go to a game. We're not bothering anybody, right? And so it's important for people to think about, how we were literally, as Carl's excellent book lays out, we were presumed criminal just by being together, right? So I think these issues become important Because on the one hand, what that does, and one of the things that Khalil Muhammad also writes about, is that he also writes about the disappearance of the white criminal, right? So we shift our gaze from what whites are doing, and then criminality is conflated with Blackness, right? And so that becomes an important way to sort of think through how these issues are played out.
And yeah, I want to, yeah, really quick. And I know we're going to get to conversations around reform toward the end here. But something that, you know, I just want to drop this little nugget for us to kind of like sit with is that, you know, time and time again, you know, I tell folks, it's not that white kids weren't acting out, right? It's not that they weren't breaking laws. It's not that they weren't committing juvenile delinquent acts, right? It's that the response to it was drastically different, right? And in fact, why for so long, even the history books have reflected kind of this like paranoia around juvenile delinquency at the mid 20th century is actually because the federal government, the state governments are pouring in funds to fix this quote unquote problem. The problem is the allocation of those funds looks drastically different in the white suburbs than it did in the Black quote unquote inner cities, right? And so what happens is you then end up with, you know, much like we see today, in the sense that wealthy Black folks or middle class Black folks then have to really think about ways of kind of utilizing philanthropic efforts in shortcomings from the state, right? Like, you know, I'm working on an article now about like what Jackie Robinson was doing at the Harlem YMCA. And one of the biggest things he was doing was funding. But it's not like New York State and New York City wasn't getting money to address problems around juvenile delinquency, but it wasn't making it to the Harlem YMCA in the same ways. And so it was the response to it, right, that becomes drastically different and really reshapes like how, you know, these stigmas and these identities have been conflated with Black people, but, you know, in particular with Black youth, you know, over time that have just been cemented. And we're still dealing with the ramifications of that today.
Could we say, and I'm going to throw this out to both of you, Shannon, we'll start with you, and then Carl, come to you. Could we say that we are dealing with then and now sort of two systems of policing? So not just two different patterns of behavior, but two actual different systems of policing. Shannon, you want to take a
Sure. So I would say, and it operates in both a formal way and an informal way, right? And so the typical easiest way to think about it is our sentencing, right, around crack cocaine, right? On the one hand, that's a more formal sense, right? When we think about that kind of legislation, but when we think about the more informal sense, it has a lot to do with police discretion, police authority, when they choose, you know, what communities will they surveil, who will they arrest, right? What laws the alleged criminal broke, and all these other things, right? And so there's a huge difference between individuals who actually engage in the same act. They're treated differently. Even if they're both convicted, oftentimes the sentencings are different. So in fact, you do have it operating both in an informal way and a formal way, right? And we see this all the time, even in the present, you know, and with, you know, the more recent January 6th uprising, or whatever that thing was, whatever we want to call it at this point.
Yeah, I mean, and to build on that, I mean, it's you know, we can make the case that it's two separate systems, or we can make a case that it's one system operating totally the way it was designed, right? That, you know, the police, if we're talking about policing, right, as a verb, which is something separate, right? And I challenge my students with this all the time, and they go crazy. I'm like, you have to be specific. Are we talking about policing as an action, as a verb, or are we talking about the police, right, as a noun? Because policing is more encompassing, right? It's broader than just, you know, the men in blue, right? Or the boys in blue, or it's broader than the badge. But when we're talking about how the police move and the police operate, right? And now we're talking about the boys in blue. You know, that they have a different type of relationship with Black people in this country and always have, right? And so it's not that necessarily that it's two systems, except that it's one designed the way to operate that it's always has been. You know, I actually share a story in the book about, there were two kids, I'm blanking on the year, but it was something, it was either late 40s, early 50s. No, definitely late 40s. And the two kids were out around Thanksgiving and they got into a fight with some like sailors who were, you know, sitting at a bar or something. And it was like either the night of Thanksgiving, the night after. One of the kids had a pair of brass knuckles on him, beats up this guy, you know, the story makes the paper. And I just remember being in awe of how the story was written in the paper, because, you know, here we have a young person with a weapon against a sailor, right? And it was like a Black Navy, I'm blank, you know, it's Friday afternoon, right? It's a Black guy in the Navy, but you know, but I just remember like being in awe because like the newspaper was literally like these two honor students were basically in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I was floored, right? Because all of the conversations around juvenile delinquency was that young people have a weird access to weapons right now, and we have to like limit this. So here you have two kids who literally had an illegal weapon, beat up, you know, a troop, right? And literally get off scotch-free because that just wasn't who the police were concerned about, right? Not in that way. In fact, their goal was to get them back to their parents because one's dad was a doctor and the other's dad was a lawyer. And so like there was just kind of this like, the police didn't show up prepared to beat their heads in or, you know, even arrest them. In fact, the police showed up in a way that they were, you know, ready to give them back to their family. And we have to understand that what the police do and how the police act with white families is also drastically different with how they act with Black families, right? And, you know, and folks who write about juvenile delinquency in particular talk about how the state becomes somewhat of a surrogate parent, right? And that, you know, the onus becomes on Black parents if their Black kids act up in ways that never falls back on white kids, right? Like, you know, it becomes this narrative about us protecting you from yourselves, right? And it's much bigger. Yeah.
You know, we see that playing out in real time right now in response, Brother King, as you pointed out, to the mob action, the lynch mob that showed up at the Capitol on January 6th. And in the aftermath of that, we can talk about that, the moment itself, but in the aftermath of that, and you see FBI rounding people up, you know, we see this, you know, the young woman, right? She's in her 20s, you know, who steals Nancy Pelosi's laptop, tries to allegedly to sell it to the Russians, right? And then, you know, and encouraging the mob in there, and the judge is like, I'm going to release you to your mama, right? Now you're going home to your mother, right? Now, I can imagine, as though she was a child, right? One, she's a young woman, fully independent. She's going to release it to your mama. So, you know, I think that speaks, Carl, exactly to what the critical point that you just made about, it's one, it's about how juveniles are treated, but even just the understanding of this white family, right? And what is our role as the criminal justice system in relation to supporting and providing aid to the white family, as you see in that particular case, perhaps. You know,
Yeah.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was going to say, I mean, the other thing that comes to mind right off the back is Kenosha, right? Kyle Rittenhouse and his relationship to his mom and what his mom meant in that moment, in that space. I mean, it's, you know, like I feel like oftentimes we find ourselves laughing to keep ourselves from crying, right? Because it's just that obvious, right? And I think what drives sort of the anger and the frustration when you see it play out is also just like white people able to navigate a world in which they are not taught to fear the police, right? They're not afraid of cops. And naturally, inherently, one thing that, you know, that permeates through all Black communities, well, I don't want to say all Black communities, but through a lot of Black communities, is actually a fear of the police, right? And that is, you know, something that has been ingrained generationally time and time again, because we know what's at stake, right? And, you know, whether we're talking about the insurrection, whether we're talking about Kyle Rittenhouse, whether like white people can move in this country in a way without fear of the police. And I think that, you know, becomes central to how, you know, whether we're talking about Black folks in the police historically, Black folks in the police today, how that, you know, has come to be, and how do we fix that needs to be, you know, be critical.
Thank you for that. I want to thank you to those who have already put their questions in the Q&A section tab. I encourage those who have questions to put them in there to populate that. I'm keeping an eye on that. We have a question about the education system from Felicia, and I'm gonna come to that in a second, come back to that in a second. But Shannon, I want you to pick up on this theme of fearing the police and the absence of it, on the part of white folk, right? That we saw play out clearly on January 6th, one of many examples.
Right, I mean, and that is important, right? And I think that as a college professor, as a Black man, as a person who is often expected to explain these issues to my students, to my college community and the like, you know, it's important for people to sort of think about the ways in which Black folks are criminalized in a way that white folks aren't, right? And even when white folks and Black folks engage in the same crimes, right, how they're treated differently, or even in cases where they're not, right? And so for me, one of the most painful conversations I had was talking about, you know, living in Ohio and talking about Tamir Rice, right? You know, it's a little boy with a fake gun. I mean, how do we, you know, he's not 6'5", right? It's not a real gun. Or, you know, John Crawford, right? I mean, how do we sort of talk about, you know, he's in Walmart, right? He's trying to purchase a gun, right? And I think, I can't remember if that was a real gun or not, but at the same time,
it was a toy gun.
Right, it was a toy
in the toy section of a Walmart that sells guns in an open carry state.
Right, well, yes, right. And so that's when we get to, you know, Carl's point. When we think about Kyle Rittenhouse, I mean, what do we do with that? Or what do we do with Dylan Roof, right? What do we do with these sort of clear juxtapositions between, you know, folks with fake guns and who are not engaged in criminal activity, and how people are easily say, well, he shouldn't have had a gun, he shouldn't have been by himself, and give all these reasons and explanations and pathologizing parents, all these things, right? But then when it comes to people who actually kill people, right? People who actually use guns, you know, whether it's, you know, I can't remember if it was McDonald's or Burger King, or you know, or even George Zimmerman, right? Where you have another case. Well, he's not even a police officer, but Trayvon Martin is again criminalized because his Black body ought not be there, right? But Zimmerman had the gun. I mean, so, you know, it becomes important to think about these questions in terms of criminality, because clearly people who engage in crime aren't necessarily ones who are being arrested if you're a white person, right? That doesn't mean that white people aren't, you know, they don't go to jail and are arrested and these other things, but there's a clear and a disparate and clear difference between the treatment, right? And so again, if we think about January 6th, I mean, it was there not only for us to see as Black folks, because we knew this already, but it was there for the world to see, right? Literally, right? I mean, this is an international embarrassment. I mean, and not only that, I mean, you know, it's very, you know, it's deep to me that you actually have Republican politicians who are, again, reframing these individuals as patriots, right? Again, we get these binaries. They talk about the summer and the rioters and what is it called?
Antifa.
Antifa, right, on the one hand. And now we have patriots, which is ridiculous, right? So again, we have these very different narratives, even for very different actions, right? And so I think that's important for people to see and to unpack, right? Because if we keep accepting this language, then there's no way in the world that we could stop, individual and innocent individuals like, a Trayvon Martin and others from being criminalized and killed, etc.
Carl, your work focuses, that first book, Presumed Criminal, specifically on Black youth, juvenile justice system and the like. Felicia asked a question about the education system and how does education, or broadly speaking, our education system, what role does that play in the promotion of Black criminality, in the creation of the presumption of Black criminality and the presumption of guilt?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's huge, right? Because the school is a space, right, in theory, that is designed to teach, right, to promote, to be as meritocratic as possible, right? The problems then become what happened in a space in which also there is adult authority to dole out punishment, right? To dole out consequences, right? Because this all of a sudden looks different. And, I also saw there was a comment in the chat, or a question in the chat about like implicit bias, right? And so, I mean, there's a way to kind of tie these two questions. If in fact you navigate a world daily that is telling you some things about young Black people that is different than young white people, naturally you are going to respond differently, right? And so, there's a conversation there about, do schools contribute to what some scholars have, targeted as the school to prison pipeline. Other scholars have kind of, shout out Carla Shedd, who's doing a lot of phenomenal work around what she's been referring to as the carceral continuum, right? So sociologists today. And, and there are ways, right, in which we can see this, right? See this literally play out. But then, comes the conversation about the role of police in schools. I think, there's a criminalization of space that happens, right? I grew up going to schools that always have police officers. Starting in middle school, right? Middle school forward, I had a police officer in the school. And like there was this sort of like normalcy that happens, right? Like, oh, hey, Detective Martin, right? And you're just like, why in the world is Detective Martin in my school, right? But that's not the questions we ask. But then we know that any kind of increased contact with police is naturally going to play out in a way with Black students in ways that it doesn't with white, right? And the numbers kind of show this time and time again. And to Shannon's point, right? Like, it's not like white students aren't having these run-ins with the police, right? It's not that white people aren't going to prison. It's not that white people aren't over-policed, right? It's that Black people are disproportionately, right? Like, it's time and time again. Police brutality and police violence needs to be on everybody's radar, whether you're Black, white, or otherwise, right? Because it is a problem of authority here. It's the disproportionate nature in which Black folks have to navigate that space. And so, so absolutely education plays a part. And education really, education in the sense of school spaces really become pivotal when they have relationships directly with the police force. And that happens at high schools, middle schools, and it also happens with colleges.
Yep, Shannon. Oh, you got to unmute.
Yeah, so I wanted to say a little bit about the educational part and to sort of expand on what Carl was saying, because it is important to think about different spaces, right? And so one is education, but it's also mental health, right? Mm-hmm. Also the homeless, right? And so part of it is we have all these different kind of social issues and problems, and we're using the police to address these issues. And so this gets back to, your initial question about how I, interface and came to some of these questions. The police are everywhere, right? They're public housing, right? They're train station, right? Mental health, homeless. There are so many different ways that the state could use their resources to address many of these different issues, but we choose the police to do it, and the result is violence, right? And so that becomes an important way to think about our children, poor people, whether in public housing, whether it's in certain schools, whether it's, you know, former veterans or veterans and folks homeless. I mean, the police are everywhere, and they're not the answer to every social problem. And so that's one of the huge issues that, you know, we have to confront, how we might reimagine the world so that the police don't become our first answer to the questions that, you know, really naturally do not require their work.
You know, we're gonna talk about in a little bit. We're gonna talk about some of your thoughts with regard to how to make policing better. These questions of reform. What does that look like? Do we even need it? So we'll dig a little deeper there. But I want us to spend a few minutes talking about the contemporary moment, the time in which we are living right now, and to turn our attention first to last summer, the summer of 2020. Following the series of police murders, the George Floyd murder, Memorial Day 2020, of course, leading to the largest protests in public demonstrations in US history. Tens of millions of people in the United States, upwards of 30 million people by some estimates, just in 1 month alone, taken to the streets to demonstrate, demanding justice for African Americans. Could you help us put that into perspective? In other words, the response. And Shannon, I want to begin with you, because in your work, you look at sort of community, right? And community politics. So how can we make sense of that reaction? It's not like this isn't the first time Black folk been killed, right, by police. This isn't the first video that we've seen. So how do we make sense of that, given all that you have explained to us, both you and Carl explained to us about this history of policing and the way in which it operates?
Okay, so I have a lot of thoughts on this, and so I'll make a comment. I also want to know what you think as a scholar who writes about Lowndes County. And so my quick response is thinking about Black Lives Matter, right, as a movement. And so part of what we know is that although people tend to connect it to Facebook and social media, that a lot of these activists had participated in various local movements before they, you know, began to think through and respond to the Trayvon Martin case or the Mike Brown case, et cetera. And so I think over time, what we see, and I think, and this is partly why I'm interested to hear what you're saying, how you would address this question. We see a sort of shift from what might be called the organizing tradition to the protest tradition, right? And so part of what we see is how these different communities over time, let's say from 2013 to the summer, first ran up against the police so that Black Lives Matter was, the quick response was Blue Lives Matter or All Lives Matter. Mm-hmm. To the degree to which by the time we get to 2020, you know, a larger swath of individuals began to embrace the movement. And so lots of work had happened over 7 years, not only in terms of that granular grassroots work, but the ways in which people were much more informed, so that by the time you get to 2020, and obviously the pandemic and all these other conditions created, you know, I think this window of opportunity for people to really literally get up and get out of their homes, right? That's another element. But so much work had been done over time that folks were prepared to engage in the protest part, which we're much more familiar with, right? As opposed to the organizing tradition. I mean, and so you actually write and talk about some of these things. And so I'm actually really interested to hear how you would.
Yeah, no, I think Shannon, I think you nailed it. I think you nailed it. You hit the nail on the head. What we saw in terms of the mobilization of so many people, some of it was new communities, new organizations, new people, right, joining for the first time. But the groundwork had been laid. I I mean, we can't understand, if we talk about a George Floyd, Breonna Taylor generation, much as we talk about a Emmett Till generation with those SNCC activists, we also have to talk about, of course, a Trayvon Martin generation, right? Because when Black Lives Matter emerges in response to both Ferguson and George Floyd, we're seeing a new generation of young people who now are attached to the continuum of Black protest, right? And so they're in conversation, they're learning, right? And the response to them is fierce. It is not, you know, hey, welcome to the suburbs, we're gonna march with y'all, right? It is, as you said, right? Well, how dare you take a knee? You know, how, you know, all lives matter, blue lives matter. And so they caught hell, but that didn't keep them from organizing, whether they were in Florida or Chicago or out in California or in New York. And so we see a steady drumbeat, right, of folk who do not go away, right? I mean, and they evolve and they expand, you know, what they're doing. So we see the connections to that in Georgia, for example, not just with Stacey Abrams, but with some of the others who have these connections to grassroots organizing, getting involved both before and after sort of those police killings in the mid, you know, the mid-teens, if you will. And so I think what we saw, for the various reasons that you talk about, right? All those other factors, people locked down, people, there's nothing else to turn your attention away from, right? To draw your attention away from, you're sort of locked in this moment. The visceral, just the horror of seeing that, right? You know, of a person just literally having their life choked out of them. But that, none of that reaction certainly doesn't last as long as it did, had there not been in place already, very much in the tradition of African-American organizing, a small cadre of folk who were dedicated and committed to organize, who have been doing this work all along, so that when the moment came, they were able to mobilize others, and others had a place to direct their energy. That's kind of how I see it. Carl, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think between the two of you, I mean, you answered a good bit of it, right? And you know, but I do think that that there's something to be said here about not only the continuation, right? I mean, you know, it's hard for us because we feel like yesterday was 2012, right? But it's hard for us to feel like those who really started, you know, getting, or if we think about Trayvon Martin as happening in 2012, right, and that's 8 years ago, we also have to realize that these are a formidable 8 years in young people's lives, right? These are this is a generation of young folks who grew up with a Barack Obama as president, right? Who then, you know, make this incredible transition into what they see as sort of an extreme right president in Donald Trump, right? So much so that they then look back and reflect on a George Bush as if times were okay, right? Like, you know, I had a conversation with some college students yesterday, actually, and they were like, you know, and just the elephant in the room is I'm youngish, right? And so I was, you know, I was in college in the George Bush years, right? But students have this sense, college students have this sense that the George Bush years were okay. And I'm like, dog, like I drove from Delaware to New Orleans in Katrina, right? Like, you know, Jenna 6, right? There were moments, there were flashpoints here, right? That if we're actually looking at this longer history, that, you know, that, and then not even longer history, but that we're looking at even this contemporary moment as something that has been regular, you know, arguably since 9/11, that this was 20 years, right, in the making. This wasn't necessarily something that just flashed out of nowhere. I do think that we cannot discount or we cannot discount or leave out what the pandemic also caused, right? I mean, and, you know, and Shannon made mention of like being able to get up and get out of your house, right, and get involved because you're working from home or you're doing this, you're doing that. As somebody who is a huge and avid sports fan, I cannot tell you what it meant to not have sports, right? There were no distractions. And so even though we have video footage of, you know, cases before the George Floyd, you had no choice but to sit with George Floyd in a different kind of way. You couldn't turn the channel. Every channel was covering it. ESPN couldn't even avoid it because there were no games, right? It was in everybody's living room in a different kind of way because of the pandemic, and that forced people to sit with this differently. And and what comes of this will be interesting, right? Because, if we're thinking of it from a sports perspective, the games have gone on, right? The Super Bowl conversation for this weekend, right? Like, the NFL started out with Black Lives Matter and then didn't hire any Black coach, right? Like, and so like the games have gone on. We have generally moved forward with this kind of, conversation that has unfortunately fallen by wayside for so many, right? It's back to business as usual. But I think it's important for us to be able to capitalize on the momentum here in terms of thinking about what we saw last summer with 2020.
We have a question from Grayson T, one of our fantastic graduate students here at OSU, working on his PhD. And Shannon, this is directed to you a little bit, but really, Carl, to you as well, and it has to do with, and I think this is the appropriate time to mention it, and it has to do with response to protests. And Grayson's question is, how did the police respond to protests, Black protests, in the early decades, 20s, 30s? He calls attention to the "Don't Buy Where You Work" campaigns, basically nonviolent direct action protests in front of stores. Was there a particular response to that, whether in the 30s or even the 60s? And how does that connect? And let me add this part: how does that connect to the response that we saw to Black Lives Matter protests? Right? They weren't welcomed with open arms by the police, right? I mean, these things, we see a violent police response to the protests in the name of seeking justice. So, Shannon, any thoughts about that? Sort of what do we see then versus what do we see now?
So yeah, so one, I would say you got to read the book when it comes out, because I do address that exactly, and so I'll summarize it. So what's important to think about, and just a quick summary of key points of the book. So there's a 1935 riot, and there's a 1943 riot in Harlem. And so the 1935 riot comes after the "Don't Buy Where You Can't Work" campaign. And so when the riot occurs, many of the local folks and writers, in this case, Claude McKay, the writer, and "If We Must Die," right, poet, who wrote the poem "If We Must Die," says that in many ways, the riot or the uprising comes out of these economic questions that the "Don't Buy Where You Can't Work" campaign addressed. And so during the actual "Don't Buy Where You Can't Work" campaign, the police were there, and they were there because they were responding to the white and usually Jewish-owned businesses, right? And so policing, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier, right? When we think about policing, it isn't just about, and often it isn't about crime, it's about how the powerful use it to maintain certain kinds of conditions. In the case of the "Don't Buy Where You Can't Work" campaign, those conditions was, we don't want to hire these Negroes or these colored people, which is the language that they use. Now, certainly, if one digs deeper into that movement, and again, I'm speaking to Harlem, but it was in Chicago and Cleveland, these other places, but I can speak more directly to Harlem. Certainly there were issues within that movement, but certainly the police showed up to create these tensions in support of these businesses that refuse to hire Black people. That's one. And then two, these issues continued when they began to discuss these issues with the Fiorella H. LaGuardia's commission, where Black folks were airing these issues out and saying that, in many ways, these issues are directly related to economic issues. And so that helps us sort of think about Eric Gardner, right? I mean, we think about how he was killed. He was just selling, some loose cigarettes, right? And we get the chokehold. We get the, I can't breathe, right? And so one can think of it as simply an issue of police brutality, but one has to also connect it to these economic questions. and the ways in which poor people are policed. And so you could sort of see a clear line between the 30s and 40s, and then eventually the riot in 1943, and we can go on up to, you know, what Carl writes about in terms of 64. We can, and all kinds of histories all the way to the Eric Garner case. So there's a clear line that runs through these questions around policing, businesses, and certainly Black folks.
Carl, we have
Yeah.
a question. Oh, go ahead. Did you want
Yeah,
to say
no,
something?
I was going to say something too, right? Because the other part of this that we can see is like the police and their efforts to then surveil, right? Conversations around surveillance of activists become real. You know, shout out Ashley Farmer, who wrote a piece for the special issue on history for Black lives that we put out in response to this summer. But the surveillance element of this becomes pivotal because of how the state then begins to track activists in particular ways, right? And, you know, and I talk a little bit about surveillance in the book as well, in particular around what the NYPD decide to do with young people, right? They decide to start categorizing or start surveilling who they were designating as potential delinquents, right? That it was a proximity to a matter of potentially committing crime was reason enough to get a case file. And this turned out to be 90% of the case files that the NYPD held in their records were labeled as potential delinquents, not kids that committed any sort of crime, but kids who had some sort of proximity to crime. We see much of this kind of surveillance power from the state around activists as well, right? And especially, you know, activists who are regularly out in public spaces, right? The ability for the police to then surveil is pivotal, whether we're talking about 1930s, 40s protests, or if we're definitely thinking about Black Lives Matter forward.
And I would add to that sort of the 21st century update, and certainly post 9/11, there's a certain degree of heightened surveillance of people, of activists, but then even the creation of databases. When we think about New York City stop and frisk, I mean, that was essentially a mass data collection of Black and brown youth who had done nothing, right? You're stopping them, you're frisking them, and essentially you're collecting data, right? On who they are and what I mean, that goes on for a decade and a half. And that feeds into, in my opinion, sort of that criminalization mentality, right? They are, and that also at the same time feeds into the fear that Black youth would have of police, right? If every time you see every time you see police, you run the risk of being stopped, right? And you know, then you wonder why a Freddie Gray would take off in Baltimore, right? Because in many ways it was safer to flee than it was to stand around and see, even if you weren't doing anything, to see what that response might be. We have a question from my colleague David Stebbin, who asks about sort of this question of the exaggerated or the subject of the exaggerated fears of Black folk among white police officers. And do these exaggerated fears, this threat perception, does it contribute significantly to the use of excessive force against Black folk? And if so, what explains these exaggerated fears? So what explains the presumption of criminality? And not just criminality, but the fear is the fear of sort of danger. It's not that the police, if I can interpret my colleagues will say, it's not that the police to a certain extent fear that if they don't stop this person, right, they're gonna, you know, rob a liquor store. It's like they feel the use of force is somehow, if I don't stop this person, I'm in danger as a police officer, right? And we all know that all you have to do is say that you're in danger, right? You felt threatened. Supreme Court said, yeah, if it's reasonable, and that's a broad definition for reasonability, then you get off. That's all you got to say. I was scared. So what accounts for that sense of fear, and does it really account for that the use of excessive force in extreme ways directed at African Americans?
Yes, I mean, I'll jump in first. I mean, I think it's real in the sense that police officers are trained to have a come home, make it home mentality, right? And you know, and it's a tough, it's a tough job, right? It's a risky job, and this, you know, I don't want to be misconstrued as sort of like defending behaviors by any means, right? But when you realize that this is kind of written, like that written into the job description is to make it home by any means necessary, right? You open up that avenue of sort of like a lack of, or any kind of lack of accountability for your actions, right? This is conflated by who choose actively to then become the police, right? You know, which kind of goes into, you know, a much broader kind of conversation about requirements and about, you know, what should, you know, should police be paid more? And if they're paid more, do you have an ability to then potentially require more, right? You know, whether it's an education standpoint, whether it's a different kind of training, but built into those reform arguments, it's going to be like that you can reform this out of people, right? And you know, for what it's worth, this is a much broader conversation than understanding white fear of Black people, because Black cops feel it too. Right, like when you have these serious sit down conversations with Black police officers, you can actually see and you can actually feel this sense of like, my job, my life is on the line every time I go outside, right? And when you're navigating in that sense of fear, it then, you know, creates, you know, a sort of pull first, ask questions last mentality, and that over time, you know, is why calls to diversify the police don't work, is why calls, you know, to increase training about implicit bias don't work. That, you know, the only thing kind of left is to force some sort of accountability for these actions, to hope that we can detract in their behaviors, you know, or get rid of it completely, right?
Yeah.
Shannon?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a, I was just taking down some notes, and Max Felter Cantor wrote this book called Policing Los Angeles. And so his book is really important because it gives you a sense of police power, right? And so to really sort of understand these dynamics, we have to think about police power. And part of that power includes their ability to create narratives, right? And so if they create narratives, whether it's through statistics, so this gets at Hasan's commentary about stop and frisk, right? I mean, if you create statistics and the statistics say, this is where the crime is, right? That means that that's where the police go, right? So that's one way of creating knowledge. I mean, again, this gets back to the early question around Khalil Muhammad's condemnation of Blackness, right? The role of statistics helps you create criminality, and it also legitimizes the need for police. And so the police are literally, you know, using statistics and targeting particular areas to legitimize their work, to legitimize the need to have more police, to legitimize the need to have more machinery, more tanks, et cetera, right? So these become ways that the police actually engaged in this rhetoric. So that's that's one way that you get to the exaggerated fears. The other part is the role of the media, right? And so that this goes to some of what we've been talking about before. I mean, the media has a role in how it describes groups of people who engage in crime, right? Are they thugs? Are these individuals who, you know, went the wrong way, or they have mental problems and they need therapy, or do they need to be killed? I mean, these are different ways in which certain groups are, you know, criminalized in a particular way, and others, you know, need therapy, right? You know, they had a moment of weakness and they're sorry for what they did, right? And so we've seen this dialogue so many, many times, this rhetoric. And so that, again, also creates this exaggerated fear of Black folks. And so it becomes important to think about, and again, this gets to Hasan's point, you know, this is how we get to the point where, you know, you have Darren Wilson, you know, and this is in I can't remember the name of the piece, it's in the New Yorker. And Darren Wilson describes Mike Brown almost as a monster, more or less. And basically, you know, the trained police officer who has a gun is afraid of this person who does not have a gun, right? Now, on the one hand, one would think that doesn't quite make sense, but if you have this exaggerated fear, if people believe that Black people are presumed criminal, and Michael Brown becomes this monster, right? The monsterization of Trayvon Martin is another piece that deals with this. Once you make these young people monsters, then that becomes a way to say, I feared for my life, and that legitimizes the use of force, right? That changes the narrative so that you can use the laws to legitimize the violence that you're having. So, in some ways, I am not really persuaded that the police believe in these things. Some of them may be afraid for their lives. Others, they're they're doing it because they know that they wouldn't be punished for it.
I'm so glad you brought up the example of Ferguson and Darren Wilson, because he's when he offers that, like when we talk about, and I want us to shift our attention a little bit towards what can we do to make policing fair and just, if that's such a thing as even possible. But one of the things that happens with Darren Wilson, he kills Michael Brown, and he's not, as with most police unions, right? And they have these particular protections, he's not interviewed immediately. Now he knows, as all police know, that if you are in a shooting, what you have to say is that you felt threatened, your life, you felt in danger, right? So he knows this, not interviewed immediately, given several days. And when he goes through this, and I encourage everyone to read the grand jury testimony that he gives, because it's public record. That's where he starts talking about, the bulging eyes. I mean, it was a Sambo-esque caricature, right? That he paints and portrays Michael Brown, right? This Hulk figure. God, I mean, the description, like, my God. And he's saying that to a grand jury, right? So he's playing on these fears of African Americans, of the dangerous Black man, these old tropes, and he's doing it on purpose. And he's doing it specifically because he knows that all he has to do is convince them that he was afraid, right? And the way you do that is that this is a Black guy who was big and he was scary. It didn't matter that I was the one with the gun in a car, right? He was the threat. And even though he was at a distance, I still had this legitimate fear. Carl, did you want to say something?
Yeah, no, I mean, I was just gonna say it's the Shamil Bell, who Black Lives Matter LA, right? It's impossible to be unarmed when our Blackness is the weapon that they fear, right? So it doesn't matter whether there's a weapon there or not, right? It's the person.
Yeah. But that threat perception is real though too, right? And Shannon, I agree with what you were saying. And sometimes it's like, are you just saying this to get out of this? Like, and then you were just mad, so you killed this guy, right? Like, is that? But we also see this threat perception play out in different ways. Like, why you, like, some of this is just anger and I can do this, right? But some of it is, we are not going to send a militarized police force, even though we have all of these white supremacists about to march on the Capitol, but we are going to send a hyped up militarized police force for these nonviolent, explicitly nonviolent demonstrators because we think something may happen, right? I mean, so I think that threat perception does play out, right? But partly because some people can and some people can't. But I think it's woven into the responses that we see both in a official capacity and in a sort of an individual capacity. Look, we have 15 minutes left, and I want us to talk a little bit about what can we do and what can be done, what's been effective in terms of police reform, reforming police action and behavior, and what hasn't worked. We know this, and either one of you can jump in, but we know this. I think it's important to say. The Washington Post has been keeping stats on police killings, and if you look at those stats over the last decade, because the federal government doesn't do it, if you look at those stats over the last decade, every year, there pretty much has been about 1,000 police killings a year. Of that, about 350 African Americans, right? That stat has not changed. Plus or minus 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. Essentially, it has not changed. That means all of those reforms, all of the police cameras, all of the implicit bias training that happened before the Trump administration and even leading on at the local level, none of that has made a difference. in the numbers of African Americans who die at the hands of police. So one, why not? And two, what can be done?
Yeah, I mean, I think about this question a lot. And to answer the why not, because I think not that that's an easier question to answer, but yeah, for us, it might be an easier question to answer. I mean, why not is that anti-Black racism lies at the center of our country's DNA, and we've just yet to address that adequately, right? That, you know, when we see these moments of uprising and these moments of protests, we know, you know, typically they're ignited by some sort of police violence, but they're almost always in direct response to systems of discrimination and segregation and, you know, police brutality, right? And, you know, we regularly fail to address those root causes, right? Be it unemployment, be it failing schools, be it the healthcare system, right? Which, again, thinking about this particular moment has been exaggerated to a T, or exacerbated, I guess, to a T. And so I think, you know, when we think about Black folks' relationships to the police in this country, we know, you know, there's constant station around this, right? We know that, you know, Black folks have been over-policed and underprotected, right? Or we know that Black communities have been over-policed and underprotected. Or you can make the case that the police job is to over-police and underprotect Black communities, right? Regardless on how you want to see that. And so I'm not sure that any of this is actually going to be corrected by reform efforts, especially no reform efforts that don't call for any kind of improved accountability measures, right? And so as we kind of envision a world in which the roles of state authorities are being reimagined, right? It's imperative that safety is considered, right? That safety for and the overall health of communities. But we, you know, I encourage us to really have that conversation about, you know, what do we need the police for, right? And, you know, and that's a, you know, I always tell my students, right? We have conversations around police abolition regularly, and that's an easier conversation to have, or I find that it's an easier conversation to have in a college classroom than it is in the middle of a Black community, right? And we have to figure out why that is. You know, and I think why that is that there's kind of this misconception that the police provide some sort of safety, that the police are safety patrollers, when in actuality, that's just not what they do, right? Very rarely do police intervene in crimes from occurring that have happened, right? They respond to crime, right, that have already occurred, right? So they're not necessarily throwing their lives out there in front of people's bullets, right? And so, you know, I will say, and before I pass it over, right, like, I mean, you know, that we need to have serious conversations around abolition. And I think it's exciting that the defunding and divestment and abolition have, in this moment, you know, become mainstream considerations, right? And that's no small feat, right? That's the work of generations and generations of activists and organizers who have been fighting that fight for decades. You know, we see it with the growing number of school boards breaking contracts with police. You know, we see it with, you know, reallocation of funds, but even defunding, right? You know, that if we think about defunding, like take money away from police and put it into a school system, if the school system's racist at its core, what good does that do, right? And so, you know, I think it's time for us to have a really serious conversation, sit down kind of thought. I don't know who gets invited to the party, but one that abolitionists have been encouraging us for decades, and that's to create a world that we all want to live in. And, you know, that's central to abolitionist thought.
Shannon, let me add to get you to respond to this as you respond to that bigger question of what do we need to be doing, given the lack of, you know, the continuation of this sort of police violence, is this question of defunding the police and allocation of resources. Our colleague, our co-host and coordinator Stephanie Shaw poses the question of, you know, do public officials get it? Given even you know, on the left side of the aisle, those who are calling for police reform, and yet we're saying that defund the police as a slogan was unfortunate, or even sort of, do they really get what we need to be doing in terms of reallocating resources? So could you, in your response, could you talk a little bit about the role of elected officials and politicians in creating a substantive reform?
Sure. So I would agree with everything that Carl has said, and some of what I'll say will be sort of adding to and expanding upon what he said. So I think the question of politics is important. And so a quick answer is, I believe in both the electoral politics response and I believe in the movement response, right? I think they're essential, and I would probably lean much more deeply on the movement response precisely because of the question, which is what role will politicians play, et cetera, right? And so part of what we have to put it in a longer historical context, part of what we have to take seriously is that we have to get beyond thinking about police as individuals, right? Mm-hmm. We even have to go beyond thinking of police as individual police departments, right? First of all, at various ranks, there are organizations. So there's the chiefs of police. They have their own organizations. The patrolmen have their own organization. The police more broadly have their own organizations. So what that means is that even if we're just limiting our discussion to the police, that these folks have organizations backing them that have local chapters, regional chapters, national and even international chapters. These folks are supported, right? So there's that. So that's important. So what does that mean? That means that both Democrats and Republicans are very clear, right? That when they're engaging in these conversations about policing, that they have to be careful that they don't, even in the case of the Democratic Party, and in some ways, especially in terms of the Democratic Party, they have to be concerned that they do not sully their relationship with the police insofar as they understand that they need them politically, even though historically they tend to vote Republican. And so the question becomes, can we pull more to the side? So a quick example is, when we think about the summer, when candidate Biden was talking about these issues, he relied on President Obama's task force report, which is interesting. But he also talked about what? Reform. Reform looked like what? Giving more money to the police, right? Giving them more training and all the things that contradict precisely what you laid out. That despite the cameras and the like, not much has changed. And so what it means is that, when you vote in a moderate Democrat, that's exactly what you're gonna get. And so that's why the social movement part becomes so essential, because you need that pressure, and you need that pressure at the national level, but especially at the local level. So on the one hand, I certainly support the laws against police use of force. I certainly support trying to vote in more progressive district attorneys and prosecutors. But I wouldn't fetishize politics in a way that I expect legislation to magically bring about freedom. And so for me, the social movements become important, because that's when where we do a Ella Baker and we say we need to support those activists who are doing that good work, or we need to embrace the organizing tradition and go door to door and make sure people are aware of the issues as they play out at the local level, to get people prepared and engaged, not only to engage eventually in mobilization, but also to engage electorally. So that's my sort of quick response.
If I can get in 30 seconds or less, which I know is impossible for y'all, because it's impossible for me. What does the future hold the immediate future hold coming out of the George Floyd Black Lives Matter protests, Joe Biden in the White House, Democrats in control of Congress, the George Floyd policing bill, perhaps going forward? What does the future hold for policing in the short term in terms of reform? Do you think that there will be some substantive reform measures that will make a difference, or is it impossible to make real change in the short term? This is just a decades-long process. Shannon, I want to start with you, and then Carl, you for a closing word.
Yeah, I think we need more time, more mobilizing, more organization, more engagement, a nexus between local folks and local politicians, DAs and the like, allies and the like. I mean, and as Carl pointed out, I certainly think the question of abolition is essential for us to think about that gap between, on the one hand, how we engage these questions in the community and how we might engage them in academic settings. I mean, that there is a tension there that we have to overcome.
Shannon King, thank you so much. Carl Sutler.
Yeah, I mean, we have to know that systems resist to being torn down, right? But this is one that needs to be torn down. And so I think the short way, the 30-second way, is that we have to let the youth react. We have to let the youth riot, right? 30 years before King was a civil right, or 30 years before Rodney King was a civil rights movement, 30 years after the movement was Black Lives Matter. What would the next 30 look like? I think anything short of that is going to be, glacial at best.
Dr. Carl Sutler, assistant professor of history at Emory University, the author of Presumed Criminal, Black Youth and the Justice System in Post-War New York, NYU Press, 2019, a connoisseur of fine sneakers and the LA Lakers. Dr. Shannon King, associate professor of history at Fairfield University in Connecticut, author of Whose Harlem Is This Anyway? Community Politics and Grassroots Activism during the New Negro Era, also from NYU, working on a fantastic book just about wrapping up now, Policing the Crisis, Black Protests and Law and Order in New York City during the Riot Era, representing Harlem, New York, and the playgrounds of Harlem back in the day, always true and forever. Thank you to everyone who joined us for this webinar. Please mark your calendars for Friday, March 5th, same time, 4:30 to 6 p.m. As we used to say growing up, same bat time, same bat channel. We will have another dialogue on the Black athlete, politics and protests in the era of Black Lives Matter. We will be joined by OSU graduate Derek White, who teaches at the University of Kentucky, as well as Lou Moore, associate professor of history at Grand Valley State University. So we will have another dynamic, informative dialogue and conversation. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Suddler. Thank you, Dr. King, Brother Carl, Brother Shannon. Thank you all who joined in. I wish you a good evening, a good weekend. Please all be safe and be well.